Good afternoon and welcome to today's live lecture. My name is Patricia Simpson, Director of Political and Online Training here at the Leadership Institute. I want to welcome everyone to today's topic, which is building coalitions. I'd like to remind everyone that we are recording this, and so it will be available on our archives probably on Friday. And we'd also like to remind you that this is in fact live, so you can ask questions at any time by emailing me at live@leadershipinstitute.org. We're joined here today by Paulo Cibaja, who is our Director of Coalitions here at the Leadership Institute. Paulo, thank you for taking time out of your day today to present to this audience.
Thank you, Patty, for having me.
What do you have for us today? If you want to just go right into it.
Sure, let's go ahead. Building coalitions obviously will be our topic for today. And we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. We're going to discuss different ways to identify potential coalition members. We're also going to identify ways to manage your coalition, whether they be supporters or detractors. And last but not least, how to actually put these coalitions to work. More often than not, coalitions just exist for the sake of existing. They're actually not working coalitions. So one of the things we want to do is change that narrative, if you will, and actually apply and put individuals who are part of coalitions to work to push public policy or to be mobilized in different campaign settings. So first and foremost, the whole purpose of coalitions for the most part is for voter identification and targeting, as well as credibility. We want to bring groups into your project, if it's an issue project, or your campaign. Because by doing so, as I stated, it brings credibility if your campaign lacks credibility, and it helps you target specific individuals or demographics in your campaign. For example, you might want to target taxpayer groups if taxpayers are what you're going for, if there's some sort of measure in the legislature that has to do with taxes, businesses, if it's regulation affecting businesses, professions, whether they be the builders, maybe perhaps the lodging industry, or people of faith, if it's some issues that pertain to the people of faith or affect them. But at the same time, you've got to make sure that you actually understand your project and also understand your campaign's deficit. By knowing your project, knowing your objective, and knowing what you want to do, you will then be able to understand where your campaign is weakest and where you need to bolster it up. So let's go ahead and take, for example, before we move on, the business community. And this is a good way for you to figure out how it would be good for you to break down a particular community and then figure out ways or different members in that community. Number one, we have corporations within the business community. And even within corporations, we also have manufacturing corporations. They may be service corporations. They may be a conglomerate where you have a parent company that oversees more than one, and their interests are different, vastly different from one another. So you got to keep that in mind. You may have trade associations, for example. Keep in mind their geography, the interest, the philosophy, and the policy of that particular trade association. Do they get involved? What is their political philosophy, and does it align with whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish? And then generic chambers. They can be a local chamber of commerce. It can be a chamber that targets specific groups, whether it be the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, perhaps the Black Chamber of Commerce. You want to keep in mind the size and the geography of these individuals, and if they are obviously surrounding the area that you want to target, you may want to bring them into the fold. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take a look at Home Depot, for example. If you have a bill that might be affecting the service industry or might be affecting individuals who work within Home Depot, this is a corporation obviously that does home building for yourself. So what you want to do to help you figure out the stakeholders in your coalition, you want to break it down. In one end, we have employees. On another end, we have shareholders, and then we have customers. This is plain and simple. But even within employees, you got to understand that you may have the craft employees, and you may have management. And then on the customer side, you may have residential customers, and then customers who are perhaps building a business or larger customers other than your mom, your dad, or just individuals. This is a good way of breaking down anything, any issue, any industry you're trying to target, because it will help you categorize different organizations and different stakeholders, and it will allow you to come up with a much bigger list of individuals that could be potentially part of your coalition. So let's move on. We have, obviously, number one, what we want to do is we want to list each group. And in listing each group, what you want to do is you want to create a database. You always want to create a database whenever you're working with coalitions. You want to write their name, you want to write their contact information, point of contact, whether it be an individual in that organization. Obviously, you want to write their address, email if you have that, phone number, and then write a few notes about that particular organization. Could they be with you? Could they be against you? Would they be good for an endorsement, or perhaps for you to fundraise from this particular group? You want to keep in mind the different ways that you can put that particular interest group to work in your coalition member, and you may want to also add different ways to rate them. Are they influential in your community? Are they potentially harmful if they were to come out in public in support of you? You want to make sure that you categorize this information. We will go on the next slide after this one. We will actually give you an example of how to do this, but you want to determine their perceived position. You want to actually find out their actual position. And last but not least, which of those individuals that you've listed can you actually influence to win over and be part of your coalition? So let's take a look at the next slide. We have perceived position. The way we find out an individual's perceived position is, who do we know that knows that individual or someone in that organization? What do we know about them? Obviously, you want to focus on the historical knowledge, institutional memory, and then you want to actually find out whether their perceived position is their actual position. Plain and simple, what you do is you actually ask them if you've got a relationship with them, or you can ask others. Do your homework. It's extremely important. Coalitions is a game of addition, as is most politics out there, so you want to make sure you know who you're talking to when you do this. I'm going to give you a perfect example. This happened during a recent election I was working on. We had an individual, influential individual within the Hispanic community. The perceived position that we had from the campaign's perspective was this individual was a lifelong Democrat. In fact, he was. Why? Because we used the empirical evidence we had available. He'd endorsed Democrats all his life. He'd actually been campaigning for individuals of the majority party in certain states, or the minority party in other states, but it was mainly the Democratic Party. And I was working for the Romney campaign at this particular time. Well, this individual was very influential within the Hispanic community. Everything we knew about him, the perceived position was that he was not going to be in support of Governor Romney or anyone down the ticket. Now, what we ended up doing is I actually had a board member, great board member, very helpful, who had a really good relationship with him. I wasn't going to approach him. He didn't know me. I didn't know him. And surely he wouldn't have shared that piece of information. So I had someone who was a good friend of his approach him. They had a candid discussion, and come to find out, this individual, this influential Hispanic leader, was actually undecided. He was not for President Obama, even though he'd endorsed and campaigned for the president in the previous election cycle, but he was not too enthused about Governor Romney. So the perceived position, the information and data we had told us he was a lost cause. He was going to be supporting the president in his re-election bid. But after doing a little homework and asking people to do a little homework for you, we found out that he was actually undecided. That gave us an opportunity to find out what their potential position could be. Where might they be? What might they do? How might they help your campaign? These are questions you have to keep in mind. Would a formal endorsement from this individual be beneficial? Perhaps all we want is to fundraise off of his list, or perhaps all we would want is for him to tap into his connections and bring volunteers to the campaign. These are things you have to keep in mind. Let's go ahead and move on. What do you do with potentially positive groups? It's actually very easy. All you do is you incorporate them into your campaign. You want to bring them into your campaign. If they are potentially positive groups, send out feelers, make sure that you know exactly their actual position, and then invite them onto the coalition. And we'll talk about how to do that a little bit down the road. Next, what do you do once you've identified potentially negative groups? This is where most people can get a little tripped up. So what do? You neutralize them when possible. We're going to go ahead and take it to the next slide. How do you neutralize individuals? Well, there's several different things you can do. Number one, you can build relationships. Number two, obviously identify common ground. Number three, you want to identify support within that group. And number 4, identify counter groups. So let's go over each one of those individually. Building relationships. My former boss in the legislature, I used to work in the legislature in the state of California, actually had really good relationships with members of the majority party. And in having good relationships with these individuals, he was able to often reach out across the aisle, build these coalitions behind closed doors, and push his legislation through. By building relationships, it will make it more difficult for someone to come out publicly and oppose you, your organization, or whatever project it is you're working on. Now, another great way of neutralizing individuals is identifying common ground. Perfect example of this, my former boss, when I worked for the public policy organization in California, one of public policy organizations, we were working on a particular bill. Now, you're not going to believe it. Conservatives tend not to align with the ACLU. But the ACLU had a bill, or had issue with one of the bills that we were sponsoring during the legislative cycle. They weren't too thrilled about certain language. We knew that obviously the language carried almost no weight, had no effect on the bill whatsoever. So what did we do? We obviously negotiated, compromised, if you will, and we said we're more than happy to remove that particular language from the bill if it means dropping your opposition. Sure enough, next day we amended the bill, we removed the language, the verbiage that they had issue with, and a few days after that, they ended up withdrawing their opposition to the bill. So, you identify common ground. That was perfectly fine by us, removing that language. They were happy with us removing the language, and we were able to neutralize their opposition, essentially get away with passing the bill without having a big organization like the ACLU, who carries a lot of weight in the state legislature.
Now, I have a question. I know that there are a lot of groups out there that think if you compromise at all, that you are essentially a sellout. What is your advice to them? What words would you give to them saying that it's not selling out, it's actually blank?
Yeah, it's actually moving the ball forward, quite frankly. In this particular instance, obviously the bill had to do with parental rights. Understanding, obviously, you never want to compromise your principles, your values. If you hold steadfast to those, you don't want to feel like you're violating your conscience. But this language of the bill had no effect, and understanding that it had no effect, it was the issue that the ACLU had, we were more than happy to compromise and see them halfway, meet them halfway, and remove the bill. There's nothing wrong with actually working with individuals from the other side. In fact, with coalitions, as I mentioned, Patty, it's a game of addition. Mm-hmm. The more people that you have in your coalition, the better it is. Why? Because the more credibility, as we talked about on the first slide, it will lend to your project, your issue, or the campaign that you're working on. It's really simple. The more, the merrier. So we'll go ahead and move on. You want to also identify support within a group. Very simple. And how do you identify it? The Teachers Association is a perfect example in the state of California. There's a lot of teachers in the state of California who don't necessarily subscribe to the policies pushed by the teachers' unions, the CTA, in the state of California. So what do? You want to drive a wedge between perhaps the membership and the leaders of the organization. Because if you identify support within that organization and even within the leadership, essentially what you can do is neutralize them because they can't come to an agreement on supporting or opposing campaigns, causes, or your project. It's simple. Next, this is the one that's often used most by campaigns when running a campaign, which is organizing counter groups. If you have a deficit, for example, with the nurses, you organize a group, Nurses for, let's say, Cuccinelli in Virginia, who might be running for governor. Or let's just use the past example in California when Meg Whitman was running. The Nurses Association went after her really hard. They really had a lot of nurses usually picket her outside of her events. And what the Meg Whitman campaign did, is they organized a counter group, Nurses for Meg Whitman. And in having these groups, obviously, it brought credibility, again, to the campaign, and she was able to speak to the nurses through this group of individuals who were active on the campaign and who wanted to help out. Very simple, organizing counter groups. Let's go ahead and move on. What do you do? You've obviously listed all the groups, potential potential supporters and potential detractors. You've identified them. You've categorized what you want out of them. Remember, you want to know what you want out of them. You found out their perceived position from what you know, their actual position by asking. Well, you've got to prepare to approach the leadership. Sometimes the leader, for example, at a church, this is a perfect way to put it, may not necessarily be the senior pastor. It may be the senior staff surrounding the pastor. So you've got to go in before you make that ask with having done a little bit of research. So you prepare to approach them. What are the leaders' names? It seems kind of silly, but it's actually very important. I always tell individuals, when you go into an interview, put it like this. When you go into an interview, would you go into that interview without knowing your interviewer's name, perhaps knowing a little bit about the organization that you want to work for? Absolutely not. So you want to make sure you know what you're getting yourself into when you're preparing yourself to approach the leadership. Also, are they a nonprofit group? Are they a civic or perhaps a community group? This will allow you to understand what they can and cannot do in order to participate in your project. Do they have membership requirements? The NRA, for example, has membership, they have members. So if you've got a candidate who's running for office, who's a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and you've got another candidate who's also a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, doesn't have a track record to prove it though. Candidate A has been a lifelong NRA member. He's been in the legislature, has in fact sponsored and voted in favor of Second Amendment bills and against bills that limit the Second Amendment. And candidate B, who claims to also be a lifelong member, not a lifelong member, who claims to be a lifelong supporter of the Second Amendment, doesn't have a membership, doesn't have a track record. It's very plain. The leadership of the NRA will likely be supporting someone that they know they can rely on and trust. So you want to make sure that you also find out if they have membership requirements. Next, do they have newsletters or circulations? This ties back to what you want that particular organization to do. Do you want that organization to pass out information within their network, their interconnections, to let them know that they're supporting you? But you maybe don't want it public. So this is a great way to do it, through newsletters or their internal circulation. Do they have a calendar of events? Important holidays that they observe. This is important. If you've got a Greek holiday that you know there's a lot of community members involved, a lot of these organizations do have calendar of events and in fact put them up online. Merge that onto your campaigns or your issue or your project, merge it onto your calendar so that way you know what's going on and when it's going on. It will give you a great opportunity to meet with leaders, casually meet with leaders, and then do follow-up meetings to try to gain their support. Are they partisan? Do the causes that they have adopted, have they actually been partisan, or perhaps have they worked along with other organizations that you could perhaps bring to the mold? Do they have public policy interest? If not, what else can you get out of them if they do not have public policy interest? So now that you've answered these questions, now that you've done the research and you understand, you want to obviously approach the leadership or the entire group. Again, depending on the circumstances. If it's at that Greek festival that you want to meet them, great. If it's a better venue, perhaps a meeting of individuals, a conference that they've put on, that might be the best way to approach them. You've got to understand and you've got to do your research. What you want to obviously explain is that your victory, your campaign's victory, is their victory. Coalitions are important, but when you don't articulate the reason why someone should be part of your effort, and you don't explain to them that by having you in office or by having this particular public policy passed, go back to Home Depot, if you've got stakeholders in Home Depot and the community that comprises that kind of enterprise, and you don't explain to them how your victory, how passing that particular bill or perhaps defeating it in your legislature means that they will also have a victory, the likelihood of participation is essentially non-existent.
I have a question. Are there certain circumstances where you could have a coalition with groups that oppose each other? That you may find common ground with this group and you have common ground with that group, but if those two groups found out that you are working with both of them, that they will no longer work with you?
Mm-hmm. That is actually a great question, Patty. Let me give you the perfect example of how it is that we deal with this. So, go back to the legislature in California. I was working for the time, Senator Nielsen. We had a bill, had to do with agriculture, and that particular year I was tasked with staffing this bill for the legislator. We had the largest working coalition that particular year, and it included individuals that were part of the environmentalist group, and it included land rights, property rights individuals. So from the total opposite spectrum. Now, what you have to do is you have to obviously be good at balancing, because if perhaps one change to the bill might upset your group to the left, another different change to the bill might upset your group on the other end of the spectrum. So you have to be able to obviously communicate constantly with individuals that are participating. And if you've identified and if you've expressed how that victory, by having that particular bill, which is what we did in this instance, go through the legislature, it was a bill that would have essentially preserved agricultural land in the state of California. Everyone was for it, and that was the sole goal. A group from the right and a group from the left, who would typically oppose one another, understood full well that it was important to get this through the legislature. It was important to work with one another, and if you lay the objective beforehand, it will make it a lot easier for you to maintain that coalition. Now, that's not discounting the fact that you might have someone drop off the coalition and formally oppose, or you may have someone who was perhaps on the fence or formerly opposed jump on. If you can maintain your coalition intact of individuals, a wide array of individuals, then that's obviously better, so long as you keep your goal and objective clear. We ended up passing the bill, in fact, almost unanimously in both chambers. Why? Because our coalition was so broad, we were able to appeal to everyone, every voting member of the legislature. So that's a perfect example of how you can work with one another. So, obviously, when the time is right, you want to ask for the group's support. If you know that they're going to have a meeting sometime soon, they usually have board meetings when making formal decisions such as this, you want to make sure that you approach them at a time adequate to their before their board meeting. You don't want to ask after their board meeting if they only meet once a month. Why? You've just wasted an entire month. And as we know in campaigns or projects, time is of the essence. So let's go ahead and move on. Putting your coalitions to work. As I noted in the earlier slides, coalitions are often ignored, are often, just a facade for a lot of campaigns. And what we want to do is we want to change the face of coalitions. We want to make them working coalitions, communities of people that come together to achieve a common cause. So number one, you might want, in the case that I explained earlier today, we wanted that individual who had endorsed the president and had in fact campaigned for members of the president's party to come over to our side and formally endorse our campaign. It brought a lot of credibility. It hit a key demographic that we wanted to hit in the state, and so we would want his formal endorsement. Two.
Just talking about endorsements and everything, we have a question from James Mason, and he is talking about there are a lot of Tea Party and grassroots conservative groups that are actually not groups in reality. They're groups of one member. And a lot of politicians and elected officials are not aware that these are just groups of one number, so they could be perceived as detrimental to their coalition. So are these groups viable as member organizations for the coalition? And the members who do have membership, are they detrimental or are they helpful?
Yeah. So James, to answer your question, coalition members can serve several different purposes. And in fact, this slide will talk about the different ways that you can put the coalition members to work. If you have, for example, you live in a congressional district, it's a very competitive, what they call a purple or swing district. It's neither red nor blue. And having the support of, say, a conservative or ultra-conservative organization during the primary might be great, but during the general election might not necessarily go well with the independents you need to capture. What you want to do as a campaign operative or as a campaign official or someone working on a project is understand these dynamics and be able to ask for what will be more beneficial for your cause. So if you are, for example, a Tea Party member, and you're building a coalition with someone, you're trying to pass education reform in your local state. Obviously, education reform is a great issue. A lot of people from different parts of the political spectrum can get behind that issue. Perhaps the Tea Party working behind the scenes would be a lot better than being the front of that particular issue. It's plain and simple. Why? Because you want to appeal to the most amount of people. And by appealing to the most amount of people, you will be able to achieve your goal of having that bill passed through the legislature. So perhaps a better front for that group, if you're having trouble with liberal members of the legislature, would be to have a liberal organization or a liberal individual who's active in that cause be the face of your effort for school reform. In California, in fact, there's a gal who started an organization. Her name is Michelle. And she started an organization to reform education. She's actually a member of the Democratic Party, and she's married to the mayor of Sacramento, who's also a Democrat. Well, her efforts, because she is a member of that party, are given a lot more credibility for education reform as if it were a member of perhaps the conservative movement, because the people that you need to target in order to get something like this through is the members of her party. So that's how you kind of have to look at it. You've got to think about that issue. Remember the first few slides we talk about understanding your campaign and your project and its deficit? That's how you would deploy such, or you would answer such question and deploy such tactics. But let's go ahead and get back to the slides. So if a formal endorsement may not necessarily be what you need, you may be able to get financial support from that group or their members. You might be able to ask for a voter database. You got to keep in mind, though, that usually getting lists from individuals may be tricky. So we always strongly encourage anyone out there listening or anyone who comes to our meetings, you have to check with your local campaign officials, whether it's the Board of Elections, whether it's the Secretary of State, whoever governs elections in your state, make sure that you check what the law is. We don't want anyone out there obviously violating the law. But if you're able to gather membership lists and then incorporate them into your GOTV, get out the vote efforts, then that's perfectly great. Another thing that you may want from a coalition, remember we're talking about putting coalitions to work, is communication to the members, groups, or support. Remember we mentioned, do they have a circulation letter or perhaps something that they distribute internally? This is a great way. If you want to be able to have a microphone directly to the group that you're trying to reach, if it's, say, the chamber, your local chamber, and you want access to the chamber members, businessmen and women in your community, that might be what you want out of their support in being part of the coalition. You may not want a formal endorsement because they may be a little divisive, but you want the group members, businessmen and women, to know that you have the chamber's support and you're able to use that as a venue to communicate with them. Another one that's often neglected is volunteers. This is a great way to volunteer. Perfect example. When I was working for the Romney campaign, what we did is we had different coalitions, and each week we had those coalition members come into our offices, make phone calls, or perhaps walk precincts, and at any given week we had anywhere between 30% to, I would say, maybe on a very powerful or eventful week, we had close to maybe 50% of the volunteer base for the state come from individuals who were part of the coalitions. We had the Women's Coalition, we had Hispanics, we had people of faith, young Americans, we had veterans, and they were all participating and coming in. So what you're doing is you're tapping into these communities and you're bringing them into your project, bringing them into your efforts, and having them actually work, as opposed to just having a facade group that says they're doing something. Next, surrogate speakers. This is a great way to recruit surrogate speakers. During Obamacare and the discussions that ensured, the debates that ensured, while Obamacare was being debated in Congress, we were able to tap, different organizations were able to tap the different coalitions that they'd formed previously. For what? If you've got a doctor who can better explain why the President's Affordable Care Act is a bad idea for America, then you're going to tap that individual who had been part of your coalition before and tap him on her to perhaps make a web video and explain why the Affordable Care Act was not the right thing or is not the right thing for America. So surrogate speakers are a great tool that you can usually find in different working coalitions. Another example, We had the New York Times come to our state, and they wanted to have a discussion on what we were doing to reach out to a certain demographic in the state. So what we did is we tapped our coalition members, people who'd been active before, people who could get in front of a news reporter, and they essentially talked about what they were doing as campaign volunteers for the campaign. It's a great way to find surrogates who would be willing to address the media or be willing to do whatever necessary to get your message out. Next, voter registration. This is a perfect example too of coalitions. If, let's say, you're working with a church group, or you've got church members in your organization or your coalition, they can take the initiative as volunteers to go to their church leadership and try to organize a voter registration drive. It is obviously natural to find conservative voters in congregations across the country, so it would make sense to have voter registration drives. That's the perfect way to put coalitions to work. And then, of course, you want participation in events. Very easy. What does this mean? You've got an event that you've got going on and you're having your candidate come. You want to make sure you have a good turnout. The press will be there. What you'll do is you will go and tap into your coalition members, invite all of them, so that way you would have a packed room. You will have volunteers that the media can talk to. You will have surrogates that the media or anyone with the press can talk to. Perhaps someone can do some introduction speeches or put them to work for these events and participation in events. It's very simple. Coalitions, like we mentioned earlier, it's a game of addition. We've given you some tools to identify or break down different interest groups within the project that you're working on. And by doing this, it will help you come up with more names. Make sure you always list them. Understand that it's important that you list everyone and anyone. I usually recommend that you sit around a kitchen table with your local confidants for your campaign or the people who are initiating the project, and just have everyone do that. Grab a sheet of paper, write Home Depot at top or whatever organization, and break it down, and then list the groups that that typically associate with the craftsmen, with the management, with the customers, with the businesses that do business with that particular corporation. And then you will come up with a much larger matrix, a much larger database that then you can continue to develop by finding out their actual position after you do a little research on their perceived position, neutralizing those that will likely oppose you after you've found out the actual position, and of course bringing into the fold those that will be with you. And last but not least, you want to put people to work. We don't want coalitions to simply be a facade. We want them to be working coalitions. So if we have any more questions, we can certainly take a handful more of those.
Yeah, we do have some questions. What do you think is the hardest part about starting from scratch when building coalitions?
Yeah, that's actually a wonderful question. So when I first got to the state of New Mexico, the most difficult part for me as a Californian, you understand California does not necessarily have a good reputation across the country, unfortunately. We had to eventually talk to individuals who did not know us and who did not know what we were trying to achieve. The most difficult part of building coalitions from scratch is actually the beginning, and that's reaching out to the people that you want to get involved. It took a little bit of creative thinking. People were not returning phone calls. People were not returning emails. And I said, you know what? I cannot continue at this rate. We've got to make sure that we bolster individuals who want to be part of our efforts. So what did I do? I tapped into the individuals who I'd already met with, perhaps had a phone conversation, people who had already interacted with me in some sense and knew exactly what it is that we were trying to achieve. And I said, would you be willing to be my ambassadors to your friends? And I said, would you be willing to provide me with a list of individuals who you think would be interested? And would you be willing to, before I reach out to them, do a little legwork for me and reach out to them yourselves and let them know I will be calling them up or following up? I am not kidding. Right after I employed such tactic, the floodgates opened up. It was a lot easier to get meetings with individuals. It was a lot easier to ask them to be part of the effort, and it just really made a huge difference.
We have one more question. What are some non-traditional groups that Tea Party groups can form coalitions with that they may not be thinking about? And then they are essentially missing opportunities?
I would say that honestly depends on the project, Patty. And the reason why it depends on the project, because if you're working on, like I mentioned earlier, education reform, if say you're working on a gun rights bill, I know in the state of New York, for example, that's kind of a hot issue. In fact, it's a hot issue across the country. If you're working on a bill that has to do with taxation, you want to obviously, as we mentioned in some of the slides, find out what the tax groups are if it's a deal that has to do with taxation. Understand that the individuals affected, who are they? Is it going to be the person, the families affected, or is it going to be the businesses that will be affected? So you always got to understand and define your project clearly, and that will allow you to understand who you can work with. Always put your best face forward. Make sure that you understand in building coalitions, you'll be working with a diverse group of people who may not necessarily always agree on everything. So if education reform is your objective and you find a group, who's left of center, who's willing to work with you on education reform, don't bring up other issues that they will just automatically run out the door. Keep it focused, and by keeping it focused, it will allow you to employ the methods far more effectively.
Well, thank you so much, Paolo, and thank you everyone else for tuning in this afternoon. We learned a lot from Paolo and hope that you learned a lot as well. Just want to let you know that this was recorded and it will be available in our archives at www.leadershipinstitute.org/activism-on-demand. Should be ready this Friday afternoon. Our next webinar is in a couple weeks. We will be taking on the topic of fundraising, everyone's favorite topic. So we hope to see you then. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.